Okay, so the bubbles should have been cached quite fast since this is a very simple simulation. So now let's load in the resulting files. As a small note, I did change the name of my node to bubbles sim. So I will bring in a file node. I will change its color. And now I will channel reference the output file of my wrapped geometry output. So right click on the output file, select copy parameter, and in the file node, paste as a reference in the geometry file. So right click and select paste relative reference. So let's take a look at the cache. I think this is looking nice. So back to frame 1. It's now time to copy geometry onto our points. Also, we need to create a p-scale enabled to control the size of that geometry. Now, to do so, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We just did this in the ink bubbles node. So dive back into your ink bubbles geometry, and we can copy all these nodes from the kill percentage to the output node. So press Ctrl C to copy these nodes. Go back to the bubbles geometry, and just below your file node, let's paste these new nodes with Ctrl V. Now let's make some space down here. And first of all, let's see what's happening with the kill percentage node. So remember, this is a wrangler that is randomly deleting a certain amount of particles. So in this case, the threshold is very high. Let's reduce this threshold, more or less about 0.25. And again, this is a matter of taste. You can always come back here and increase or reduce the particle amount as you wish. Now the attribute randomize, remember this is randomizing the p-scale attribute. So we can also change the name of this node to set p-scale. And if I remember correctly, we're using very low values. So the minimum size is 0.001. The maximum is 0.0025. So let's take a look at the spheres that are being copied onto these points. Remember, we're just creating a very simple sphere, connecting it to the first input of the copy to points. And since we already have a p-scale value, we can definitely control how large or how small these spheres are. So one more thing I'm going to do, I'm going to change the name of this node to out bubbles. And at this point, I think we're ready to render. So let's go into the output context. We can use the ink bubbles mantra node as a base to create the new render layer. So Alt click and drag this node. And to avoid confusion, let's change its name to bubbles only. And if you remember what we were doing with this mantra node, we were forcing only the ink bubbles to be rendered. And then we were using the ink as a matte to create some occlusions on the bubbles that were on the back of the ink volume. So in this case, we can do the exact same thing. But what I did in my final render was avoided the holdout matte, and that way I could use these bubbles or debris in the foreground or in the background. So hopefully this will become more clear in the compositing stage. For now, let's just delete this ink from the forced matte, and let's change the ink bubbles for the bubbles geometry. So you can type the name of the node here, or you can also click on this button to the right to choose your node from a list of geometry in the scene. So just double click on bubbles, and I think that should be enough. We have the name of the mantra node. Remember, the output image will take the name of this node to create a folder and also to name the resulting files. So let's create a test render. If you go to render view, select the camera 1, and under the mantra node, make sure that you're selecting the bubbles. So in this case, all is good. Let's click here on render. Okay, so it seems to be working fine. Remember, we have a defocus on the camera. This is the focus we set up when we rendered the ink. Now the lighting may be a bit bright, but again we're going to try to fix these details in the compositing stage. One final thing that we need to take care of is the material for these bubbles. So currently this render is being created with a default material. So remember we created a bubble materials before. So let's go to the material context. Let's look for this material bubbles. Copy this node and back onto the object context. Make sure to select the bubbles geometry and under the render tab, paste the material we just copied with Ctrl V. Then press enter. And now we will see the transmission of the material. So the spheres shouldn't be as solid as the previous test. And although the particles seem a bit too bright currently, we will fix this in comp in a few minutes. So let's go back to our output context. Select your bubbles mantra node. Scroll up until you find your render frame range. Just make sure you're rendering the entire animation, and now you can hit the render to disk button. I will be back in a minute to create our final compositing.